Hello there, and a huge welcome to you all. My name is Deborah Alcott-Tyler, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Directory of Social Change. And my charity, DSC, believes that society is made better by human beings coming together to support each other, their communities, and causes that they care about. And that one of the best vehicles for making that successful is charities, working through and with charities. So we do whatever we can to help charities thrive and survive in our country. And that's through training, giving people information, to help them to do their work, advice on funding, charity law, charity finance, leadership, and so on, all sorts of things like that. But at the heart of DSC is a belief that data is incredibly important, solid, grounded, good research that gives us all the bedrock on which to build policies, laws, interventions that help our society better and serve our citizens. And this is where today comes in. Today is the launch of our latest Sector Inside report into the Armed Forces Charities, done in partnership with Forces in Mind Trust. And this is actually a partnership that we've been engaged in now since 2014, and which actually was driven very much by their desire to properly understand the Armed Forces charity sector that they were set up to serve. And of course, that chimes totally with the values of DSC. Originally, we were scheduled to present or to launch today's report at the House of Lords, actually back in April. Events means that we're actually here in my living room and not actually at the House of Lords. It's a pity because the House of Lords is a wonderful venue and my sitting room, much as I love it, doesn't really compare. But on the plus side, there's no security or queuing up and no one cares what you're wearing from the waist down. Anyway, today's report represents a year's worth of work to build on previous work that we've done. And later you'll be hearing from Stuart Cole, who's our research manager and the lead author of the report. And so far we have, with the support of Forces in Mind and COPSIO, who many of you will know are the representative membership body for Armed Forces Charities, we've published 9 reports and run the Armed Forces Charities website. And these resources are used by practitioners, policymakers and government to better understand the sector so that they can make informed and wiser choices about what change needs to happen to better serve our Armed Forces community, of which I am inordinately proud. As an aside, of course, this work isn't just important to DSC, it's also important to me personally. I come from 5 generations of military service on my father's side and 2 on my mother's, and I have, so many of my family are veterans themselves, and I have a brother who is still serving. So this matters to me too. Anyway, we are incredibly proud of this work, as I've already said, but we're also very proud of Forces in Mind Trust. DSC actually is an expert in trusts and foundations, those that give money. We've been researching them for over 40 years, so we know what good funders look like, and they look a lot like Forces in Mind Trust. But really, you're here for the data and the findings. So I'm going to hand you over to Ray Locke, who's the Chief Exec of Forces in Mind Trust, who's going to talk about their work and their philosophies. And then after him, you'll hear from Stuart Cole, the report's author, who's going to take you through the key findings. Enjoy, and thank you for joining us.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ray Locke, and I'm Chief Exec of the Forces in Mind Trust. And on behalf of the Board of Trustees and all the staff, I'd like to welcome you and thank you very much to this virtual launch of a really important report that we're very pleased to be sharing with you all today. The Forces in Mind Trust has been going since 2012. We were set up by what was then the Big Lottery Fund, now the National Lottery Community Fund. And we've been going for 8 years now. And our mission, put very simply, is to enable all ex-service personnel and their families to transition successfully and sustainably into civilian lives, which by their own measure, they would describe as fulfilled. It's a pretty straightforward mission. I dare say on the call this afternoon, most of you will agree that that seems like a worthy endeavour to be part of. And the way we do our work is that we fund people to create the evidence about how we can improve the lives of the Armed Forces community. We take that evidence and we use it to influence people to make better policy decisions, and people who are providing services to provide those services in a better way. When we take our funding, we use it in one of 4 ways. A lot of our funding is in the creation of that knowledge and evidence. And of course, today's project very much fits that bill. But we also spend time and effort and money on influencing and convening people. And of course, this afternoon is a very good example of what we're doing there. We do bring people together, and we invest again our time and effort in collaboration and bringing people together to collaborate. But we also improve the armed forces charity sector, and particularly by investing in leadership development. And then finally, we invest in capacity building of the sector, perhaps rather more than individual organizations. The reason we're doing this is very simple. We think that those six outcomes around the outside of this graphic are the key constituent parts of a successful transition. If you get your housing and your employment, your health sorted, if you have good relationships, if you're not in the criminal justice system, and if your finances are in good shape, then you are going to make that successful transition. But what we have found over the last year or so is that we're spending an awful lot of money, and well spent, I have to say, in what we're describing as our enabler program. Each of these outcomes comes with a program. And this enabler program, as you can read at the bottom of the screen there, is all about generating a much better understanding about the armed forces community and about the armed forces charity sector. And one of our key projects in this enabler program, of course, is our work with the Directorate of Social Change. We have a fairly modest team, well, modest by number, if not by nature. And normally, of course, we'd be based in London. And ideally, on a launch like this, you'd be able to mix with all my team, pick up business cards, have a glass of cheap and flat fizz, and increase your understanding and your ability to network. Obviously, we can't do that today, but I would like to invite anybody who's interested to follow up this launch today by directly contacting either one of my team members through this medium, or indeed you can get us through our website, our Contact Us website. We are small, but we like to think that over the years we have improved our impact. And what I would say is that as the years have gone by, the Forces in Mind Trust's ability to make that positive change, which we believe the armed forces community deserves, has increased. And only last week, we published our 2019 impact report. And again, I would strongly recommend you have a look at it. It describes how it is that Forces in Mind Trust can make an impact, how we are improving the lot of the armed forces community with a focus on ex-service personnel and their families, and that really important transition into civilian life. But of course, the Armed Forces Charities project, which we've been running with the Directorate of Social Change and COBTIO, the Confederation of Service Charities, has been going almost as long as the Trust itself. It was one of the first projects I became involved in. And our sector insight, which we published in 2014, was the very first time that an independent and credible organisation had taken the time to look at the armed forces charity sector and determine what it looks like, how it can be organised better, how it can act in a more effective way, and also, of course, how to bust those myths around certain topics, which even in 2014 were very familiar to us even now, about reserves, about collaboration, and about overlapping and duplication. And I think that the project which we're launching today, which is very much the child of this 2014 project, is one that I hope will allay some of those myths and will actually highlight once again both the importance of the armed forces charity sector to our nation, but also how it can improve. Now, it takes place, of course, against the backdrop of the global pandemic. And whilst we acknowledge in our preparatory remarks that this has clearly had a huge effect on the sector, it is worth just highlighting what I know has been said before and will be said again, that most of this research has predated the global pandemic, but it's still really important. And as I say in my preface, certainly, I think this is an essential piece of work and one that will ultimately help the Forces in Mind Trust deliver its mission. I say thank you again for attending this afternoon. I'm looking forward to having perhaps a little bit of an online debate at the end of it, and looking forward also to hearing the full details of this report from Stuart
Hello, and on behalf of my team, a very warm welcome to this launch. My name is Stuart Cole, and I'm DSC's Research Development Manager. I'm also lead author on the report, and I manage DSC's Armed Forces Charities project, which is generously funded by the Forces of Mind Trust. My plan today is to condense the findings of the report into a quick overview. I give you some key findings and also tie some of those key findings to the current situation with COVID-19. So first of all, what is an armed forces charity? So it's a charity which exists to support serving and ex-serving veteran members of the armed forces community and their families. So our first finding then is a relatively small number of charities generate and spend close to 1 billion annually in support of the armed forces community. How many charities exactly? Well, there's 1,843 charities, and we provide analysis of these charities in the report. But small relative to what? So first of all, small relative to the rest of the charity sector. So armed forces charities represent just under 1% of all UK charities. So pretty small so far. But also, armed forces charities aren't just one homogenous blob. They don't all do the same thing. They don't all act in the same way. And so we categorize them into different types of charities. And here they are. So we've got association branches, and they organize social gathering and and membership activities on a local level. Welfare charities, which are the type of charities people typically think of when you think of a charity, those charities that provide relief in need and support for individuals and grants to individuals and organizations. We've also got heritage charities, and heritage charities preserve armed forces history, and they are responsible for memorials and historical societies and museums and remembrance activities as well. And last in the big four, they're service funds, which support serving members of the armed forces community in terms of providing facilities or services to improve the morale or the well-being of serving armed forces personnel. Okay, well, let's take a look at these types of charity now in relation to the finances of the sector. And you can see here the total income is 1 billion. The total expenditure from all forces charities is 985 million. And you can see on the two graphs, in the purple there, they're welfare charities. Now, if you remember back to the last slide, we said there was just over a quarter, so 26% of charities are welfare charities. But actually, they account for 70% of all income and just under 70% of all expenditure. So that's, in terms of income, 779 million from welfare charities and 686 million expenditure from welfare charities. And then you've got, beneath them, you've got heritage and service funds charities. And if you can spot that little slither right at the top in black, they're the association branches that we had at the top of the last slide. The most numerous, 601 of them. But actually, they're financially very small, typically with incomes under 10,000. So that's the lay of the land in terms of financially. Let's have a little look at where welfare charities get their money from then. Well, when you look at adding a few of these up, it actually comes to 92% of their income is from public donations. So voluntary income there, you've got collections and direct debits, you've got earned income from charitable activities, maybe selling products and services, membership fees, subscriptions. They also have a legacy income, which is donated from people's wills, of course. And then you've got activities which generate income. So, for example, shops, charity shops, fundraising events. We said at the start there, there's quite a few welfare charities. I don't know if I mentioned actually, but there are 479 welfare charities. But top 88 of those charities are the ones which generate the most income. So actually, 70%, 750 million is all generated from 88 welfare charities, which is a huge amount for a small number of charities. Let's take a little look at another finding. One of the findings which we discussed in the report is grant making. And we found that there's a really collaborative approach to grant making, really well-considered approach to it. Here's some figures on grant making. So 63.8 million at least was awarded from armed forces charities to other charities in terms of grants to organizations. And also we found that there was a really collaborative and coordinated method of sourcing and distributing these funds among charities, which we discussed in the report. Just as an interesting note, welfare charities, we mentioned earlier, account for just over 45 million, so 70% of all the grants to organizations come from welfare charities. Another finding, the population of armed forces charities is contracting, not growing. So let's get some numbers on this. So 490 charities closed since 2012 to 2019, and only 380 opened. That's about 40 charities a year closing, and visually it looks like this. So you've got a real drop-off from 2016 down. And we think that, especially with the advent of the impact of COVID, that's going to seriously increase beyond 2019. But more on COVID a bit later. So who's opening and who's closing? Well, you can see there straight away association branches have that big red bar of closed charities next to only a small green bar of open charities. And in fact, you can pick out there's 173 more closures than openings between 2012 and 2019 for association branch charities. It was typically smaller local charities. And when you look at the data in our report, every year there's a consistent drop-off of those charities. Also to pick out, since we've mentioned in the welfare charities, there's quite a lot of openings and quite a lot of closures there. So we dug into this a bit more. And you can see from left to right, 2012 to 2019, the scale of opens and closures. So you can see in 2015, it's pretty neck and neck. And as we get to 2018, 28 more closures than opening for welfare charities. This becomes quite interesting because when you look at the operational lifespan of those who are closing, those welfare charities typically last for around 10 years and then go. At the end there, the 2019 data, it's neck and neck as we talk about sample, but of course, there'll be more data available as charities submit their 2019 annual reports and accounts. So it'd be interesting to see how that shapes up, again, especially in regard to COVID. Actually, just as a matter of interest for these charities, 80%, I think it's 83% of welfare charities have incomes under 500,000. So 391 of them actually have incomes under 500,000. So the majority of them are very small, but those 88 bigger ones are the ones which are, we saw earlier, responsible for the vast amount of the sector's income. Those ones which are closing might be closing because they haven't enough public support or enough income, or they might be closing because they've met their charitable objects and they decided to close. So I also said I'd talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 on charities. We said earlier that welfare charities, as our example, 92% of their income was from the public. And the situation with COVID is that these charities that rely on public support are going to be the hardest hit because the public are now facing an economic problem. There's a recession, and they're going to have less money to be able to give out. Fundraising events in particular have been cancelled. So summer fundraising events from March onwards simply didn't exist. And for many charities, that's their source of income for the year. Also, I mentioned welfare charities and their grant making. 70% of grants to organizations was from welfare charities. And there's a knock-on effect here because if you're a welfare charity and your income from the public is reduced because of COVID, then your ability to make grants to other organizations and therefore to help their income generation, there's a real knock-on effect there. So charities are likely going to have to rely on limited resources financially in order to serve potentially an increasing beneficiary population as beneficiaries may be approaching charities for more help as the economic situation bears upon them. What about reserves in terms of what we found in COVID? Here's our finding. 60% of charities have incomes above, which have incomes over 500,000 could cover 12 months of expenditure from the reserves. So conversely, 40% had less than 12 months available. The Charity Commission and the Scottish Charity Regulator say there's no one-size-fits-all approach to reserves. And charities should set their reserve strategy in line with what they need with their strategy, what they need, what they expect to be spending, and have to publish that in annual reports and accounts. And in the report, we've looked into this. We found some of the examples we gave showed really clear and really well thought through examples of charities who were putting money away for programs. They were looking to cover unforeseen costs or emerging need from beneficiaries. The problem is now with COVID, charities are having to accelerate that. So whereas they had reserves put away to enable this later, to make sure reserves are there to make sure you can continue to serve your beneficiaries, even when times are hard. Well, times are hard now, and a lot of charities are having to go into their reserves or burn through their reserves to stay afloat. And also to mention that the time for saving is, for many armed forces charities, may have been and gone, because if you think about just gone as VJ Day and V Day not long before, we had RAF Centenary and a few other significant anniversaries earlier this year and the year before. But those significant events are drying up now. There's not many for quite a while, except for Armed Forces Day every year. There aren't those national days of recognition like there were before. And the impact of that may be that Armed Forces charities aren't so much in the public consciousness, and therefore giving to Armed Forces charities may dwindle. Couple that with the fact that charities are having to use reserves and having to spend what they have, assuming they could spend their cash reserves and their unrestricted reserves, which not all reserves are, then what that means is charities are going to struggle in the long term, the medium to long term, in terms of how much they have to spend. And that might have a knock-on effect in terms of the services that they can provide to beneficiaries. So here's some implications then. The size of the sector, we think, is going to shrink more, and more than just the average 42 charities a year. With the advent of COVID and the impact particularly on welfare charities and those smaller association branches and all of the other charities actually, but having explored the welfare charities in this presentation, let's stick with that. Their income is going to be significantly impacted on. Their ability to make grants to other organisations is going to be impacted on. The majority of those welfare charities are smaller charities. So the size of the sector financially and in terms of number is going to fall, we believe. Resources and need, there's potentially more need and less resources to support that. Uncertainty for smaller charities who maybe serve a local community, maybe serve a smaller community, but still offer specialist and direct support to a beneficiary base. And they may not have the ability to go online. They may not have the money for those overheads to have the computers, to have the facilities online, to direct support. And so there's a knock on there. And the financial pinning, therefore, is at risk because we said welfare charities account for 70% of income and expenditure, but 92% of that income and expenditure is from the public. There's a real financial risk there that what are essentially the financial backbone of the armed forces charity sector, those welfare charities, and the knock-on effects from the impact on them could really undermine the finances of the sector. And lastly, of course, we mentioned those medium to long-term implications, where it's not just now, the impact of spending reserves now, of not being able to save reserves later, is going to have a huge impact on charities and their ability to serve the beneficiaries, which is the only reason they exist. So a few conclusions then. So armed forces charities are never more needed. The report looks at the provision made by armed forces charities. It looks at how armed forces charities are categorized. And you can see that there are smaller pockets of armed forces charities who deliver really specialist directed support, typically groups of about 100 charities for different areas of support. And if they can't survive, then there's implications for that beneficiary group. There's other implications for charities have to pick up that support, or statutory bodies have to pick up that support. And also, I mentioned the expertise that they have would go, and the poverty of expertise, again, has a huge knock-on effect for those beneficiaries who rely on armed forces charities. We said COVID has serious implications for armed forces charities, certainly. We believe the data in our report provides a snapshot of pre-COVID and the direction that armed forces charities are facing, or heading rather, but also how they might be impacted on by the COVID situation in terms of how they generate income. So recommendations, certainly more research on armed forces charity in terms of the impact of COVID. This report is essentially the before, and more research can be the after and see the impact of that. But also, one other thing we highlight in the report is more understanding, more public understanding and awareness of how charities operate. And that's not on the public, that's on the charities, that's on the charity regulators to share, here's how we structure our reserves policy, for example. There's been a lot of media attention about reserves lately. And COVID is a perfect example of why you have reserves. And it's a perfect example of charities using their reserves as they're there for, to support and make sure beneficiaries can be supported, but using those reserves in such a way which makes sure the charity can survive. So definitely it would be good to see more in the public about how charities operate, how they structure income, expenditure, reserves, how they help folk. Lastly, I hope you can join us for the Q&A. I've tried to give you a few overall findings. Then there's many more in the report, and you can see a snapshot of them in our executive summary and in the conclusions section. But download the report on armedforcescharities.org.uk, our project website. Download it for free. You can also visit us online at dsc.org.uk and follow us on Twitter at DSC Charity and at Forces Charity. Thanks very much.
So as you can see, I've moved outside to finally close down this pre-recorded bit of this launch. So you've now heard from Stuart and you've heard a bit from Ray, and I hope you found it useful and interesting. You can find out more about the work of DSC, my charity, at www.dsc.org.uk. And actually, if you visit the website, you'll be able to find the link to the report, to the launch report, and you'll be able to download that and read that for free. I'd like you now, if you're willing to stay around, to join myself, Ray, Stewart, and the chair of COBCO, Sir John McColl, to find out more about the report, to ask us any questions, to engage with us, because we're really interested in hearing from you, your views about what's going on in the sector generally, as well as the specifics around the report. And of course, you can find out more about the work of COBCO and the wonderful Forces in Mind Trust. So I do hope you'll join us for the live Q&A very shortly. Thank you.
And I can see here we have our opening question already, and that comes from Clive Spencer. He asks, if reserves are being used, why are we closing down respite facilities? RAF Association and British Legion have closed 6 to 8 so far.
I mean, I can't speak for those charities, but I would say that if reserves are being used, then it's up to those individual charities. And if they have reserves, that is, and if they have reserves which are unrestricted reserves that they can use, then they can use that to try and make sure that their services continue. A lot of charities won't have reserves, and when we looked at the data, 40% didn't have enough to cover 12 months. And there'd be charities which, of course, don't have reserves. It takes a long time to generate reserves. So for some charities, they may have no choice but to close down. And for other charities, they may be able to use reserves. Deborah has a point on this.
I was just going to say it's a really difficult one, because whilst at the same time as like trying to survive, you have to be thinking about the future. So you can be using your reserves now in order to keep the charity going now, but at the same time, you've got to think about your business modelling for 2021 and beyond. And so I suspect, without knowing the specifics of those particular organisations you're referring to, it would seem to me it's actually prudent leadership to be using reserves to keep paying the cash to going now, whilst at the same time closing services that's going to save you the money in the longer term, so that you are still going to be here in 2021 and 2022.
Fantastic, thanks for that, Deborah. We have another follow-up question from Abigail Rowe, also about reserves, who asks, can you please talk a bit about what level of reserves you think a charity should hold? We would like to hold 12 months, but this sometimes goes against us when applying for a grant.
Should I pick that up?
Yeah,
again, yeah. So the interesting thing about reserves is you're sort of caught a bit between the devil and the deep blue sea. On the one hand, it's considered good practice to have some reserves for rainy days, just as we're having now. On the other hand, donors, and as Stuart has said, the vast majority of the money that comes into the military charity sector comes from public donations. Donors don't want to donate their money to you for it to sit in a pot somewhere, accumulating interest, etc., for a rainy day. So you've always got to create that balance between what's going to be in the best interests of the organisation and what's going to actually carry out the wishes of the donors and serve your beneficiaries. So there isn't an ideal number. You'll often hear people saying something like 3 to 6 months operational costs, or you need to make sure you've got enough money to close down the charity. But the reality is, if you have closed down charities, which I have, though that's not how reserves get used anyway, because even if you choose to go into voluntary administration, decisions about where that money goes is going to be taken out of your hands anyway. So I think it has to be context dependent for your particular charity. I would be wary about using other people's guidelines. I think you have to ask yourself how more often, and certainly in the wider charitable sector, reserves usually cover funding gaps. So those gaps between where you've applied for some funding and you're not going to get an answer for another 2 or 3 months, or that you have got an answer, but that grant isn't going to come for another 2 or 3 months. So they're usually used to cover those funding gaps.
Thanks for that, Deborah. Next question.
I'd also add to that just briefly. I know COBCO do some really good aid memoirs on topics like this for their members. But there's some really interesting quotes from Charity Commission and OSCA, the Office for the Scottish Charity Regulator, and they said there is no formula. Basically, you set reserves as in line with the model for your charity, and you have to justify that as well. And what's interesting for me is when you look at that guidance from OSCA, I have it in front of me actually. Some of the things they mention are it's funds for unforeseen emergencies, it's funds for day-to-day operational costs or covering long-term absences, grants that aren't being renewed, or plan commitments, etc., short-term deficits. And what we're seeing lately with COVID is kind of a perfect storm of all of those things in the one go. So it's very difficult, and I appreciate how you phrase the question in terms of what's right for you. But that is essentially it. It's what's right for your charity, for your charity's model, and justifying that in your annual report.
Yeah, could I come in there, please, Ryan? I just make the point that I absolutely agree that well-run charities with positive reserves should not be penalised when they bid for funds. That absolutely doesn't make sense. If you look at the COBSIO guidelines on governance, we encourage charities to be properly prepared for the unexpected, and that means having reserves. And indeed, when we're talking to the funders with whom we have regular contact, for example, the Armed Forces Covenant Trust and the benevolent funds, we make the point to them that it is really important that we do not prejudice well-run charities by holding back simply because they have reserves. They will ask you to declare it, but they will bear it in mind. They will not, I hope, penalise you, and I think that's really important. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And our next question comes from Hans Pong. He asks, could the DSC team comment on whether you looked at the extent to which armed forces charities collaborate with one another, as well as charities outside of the armed forces sector with similar objectives? This might be a good one for Ray to cover.
Yeah, thanks, Rhiannon. Let me talk about collaboration a little bit. The first point to make is that one of the reasons why we asked Directory of Social Change to do this work for us is because they're not part of the armed forces charity sector, and they have a hugely, credible reputation amongst the charity sector. So, as somebody myself who is a member of the armed forces charity sector, to have the DSC take a look and say, actually, collaboration isn't bad, then for me that's quite a promising finding. I think one of the problems that we do face, though, is that there are a lot of charities in the armed forces charity sector that have grown up for fairly specific needs and do find it difficult to coordinate and to collaborate. Not because they don't want to, because actually, practically speaking, collaborating is hard, and we know that. What COBSIO is trying to do, and I sit on the board of COBSIO as well, is trying to help the armed forces charities collaborate more easily together and coordinate better in what they're doing, and hence the agenda, which is entitled Efficiency and Rationalisation, which I know Sir John can talk about a bit more if you want to, is the sort of the direction of travel. I think it's also fair to say that within the sector, there is collaboration which could perhaps embrace other charitable sectors and where that could be improved. And the report does certainly show that. And I think that's an area that certainly within the strategy work that COBSIO has been doing, we're acutely aware we need to do a little bit more of. What I'd like to do, Rhiannon, I think I'd like to ask maybe Deborah or Stuart to just talk a little bit about the comparison of the armed forces charity sector with other sectors, and then perhaps we could go to Sir John and just pick up on the COBSIO agenda.
Yeah.
Stuart, I'll let you take that first, and then I'll chip in.
I'm just digging through my notes to find the comparisons. It's a big report, and there's lots in there. I'm trying to find the exact ones. But when you look at, off the top of my head, when you look at other areas of provision, I think in the report we mentioned, I think health maybe, or education as areas of provision. There's about, I think we say about 8 to 10,000 charities in that group, I think, off the top of my head, but it is in the report. And if you look at armed forces charities, it's much, much smaller. And when you look down at the digging into the types of provision, then it's much smaller again, where you get typically groups of about 100 charities who specialise in either housing support or mental health support or education. And we've done the research on this. And so they're all much smaller pockets. What I would say as well is COBSIO have clusters, which you may have heard of. And part of that is collaboration. And I actually can speak of, as an outsider, as someone who's not from a military charity, I visited one of the cluster meetings as part of our research. I was invited to it. And you could see around the table, it wasn't just COBSIO armed forces charities. It was statutory bodies, it was local charities, it was local and other charities, non-armed forces charities. And they were all there with the same common goal, which in this case was actually to support the criminal justice needs of the armed forces community. So for me, that was really impressive. And I can also say, The housing cluster are an award-winning example. They won the Soldiering On Award for collaboration. They're a brilliant example of working with not just other forces charities, not just other like-minded forces charities, a much wider body of support. There's examples in the report of other organisations and other communities of charities who get together to make sure that beneficiaries are supported. And one other thing I'd say is I also visited Stoll, the housing charity, and one of the things they mentioned was, if they have a fire in one of the buildings, the other housing charities will come and support them with that. It is a huge amount of collaboration between charities, with the wider sector and with wider statutory bodies. Quite impressive, actually.
And in fact, just adding to that, if you look at the wider sector, not just the military charity sector, legendarily, the sector is competitive. Everybody wants to survive because they care about their beneficiaries, not about other people's beneficiaries, although very often they mix. And I would say that although the data, as Stuart said, is incredibly thin around collaboration generally across the sector, it's pretty strong in the military charity sector, and it is pretty good, is the honest truth. Of course, there are areas where people are fighting each other, because that's normal. It's human beings passionate about the people that they're serving. But on the whole, the levels of collaboration in the military charity sector, or the armed forces sector, tends to be, I would argue, slightly better than it certainly is in the wider sector. It's also in the wider sector, you very often see collaboration ends up being takeover. It sort of starts with people working together and they get sucked in. That tends to happen less in the armed forces charity sector. Typically in the wider sector, what you find is that people say, let's all merge and have just one sort of slightly bigger charity. And then all that happens is the charity that got absorbed by the bigger charity, a new one springs up, because people like to have smaller independent charities, which is why I think it is one of the strengths of the armed forces charity sector, that they do tend to keep their independent identity. And, and Sir John will probably talk about the fact so many of them are very niche and so very, very specific, very targeted things. So it's important to dig down into the data. Looking at the overall numbers doesn't really give you the whole picture.
Okay, if I may, let's just look at what the sector does in terms of cooperation and collaboration. Well, first of all, it has COBSIO. It has an organisation which is charged with encouraging cooperation and collaboration. Secondly, it has the clusters that Stuart's referred to, about 10 of them in all, ranging from housing through criminal justice to employment. It then has the CMS system, which amalgamates funds which are allocated to ensure that the whole sector can contribute. That system is paid for by 9 charities, used by 128. So that's a brief overview. I could also mention Contact, which is in the process of trying to develop a mental health system for making sure that we have coherence in the way that we deal with mental health right across the sector, and indeed connecting back into government. So rather than say it's not bad, Deborah, I would go further than that and say I would challenge any subsector in the charitable community to come forward and demonstrate to us that their instruments of cooperation and collaboration hold a candle to anything in our sector. They absolutely can't do it. We are the market leader. Now, I'm not saying that it's perfect, and I'm not saying that we can't do better. And indeed, we're going to have to do better. Why? Because when it comes to COVID, we are, as Stuart in his introductory video mentioned, we're going to have to do more with less. We're going to have to provide the same kind of service we wish to do to the people we serve, our beneficiaries, and we're going to have to do it with less resource. And the only way that we're going to do that is by cooperating more and collaborating more. And that doesn't mean merging one charity into another and coming into one big service charity. What it means is, at one end, perhaps sharing a building, sharing the accountants, sharing service providers, joint utility provision. And then at the other end, it could result in some kind of merger, but it doesn't necessarily have to be there. What it means is cooperation and collaboration. And we in COBSIO are running a forum which allows people who are in difficulties as they come into the post-COVID period to come to the forum, and we will help them work their way through it. Again, I wonder if any other sector has that. So I come back to the point. I don't think we need to be at all shy or diplomatic about this. in this sector, we have the market leader in terms of cooperation and collaboration. If anybody disagrees, come forward with evidence and demonstrate that somebody's doing it better, please.
Thanks for that, Sir John. So we've had quite a few questions through on the topic of collaboration, which I think have been covered quite excellently there by our panel. So I think we'll move on to a new topic now. The next question comes from John Mooney, who asks, what mitigating actions have or might be taken to support armed forces charities impacted by COVID? Ray, you might be able to share some insights on that.
Yeah, thanks, Rhiannon. Well, I mean, I'm probably going to steal Deborah's thunder here, but you know what hasn't happened is the government hasn't stepped forward and provided the financial support that it has done to many other sectors across the charitable sector, and the armed forces charity sector has suffered from that as well. So in terms of mitigating the immediate loss, and Stuart demonstrated where that losses have been incurred, then frankly the only glimmer of light has been the very small amount of money that has been awarded to the through the COVID Impact Fund, which has gone to armed forces charities. But that's been a drop in the ocean. And whilst it's nice to reflect that some of the evidence for gaining that funding came from the Director of Social Change Work, it's simply not enough. And one of the things that we want to do going forward is to continue to generate this evidence of how the armed forces charities have been affected by COVID, and continue to put it on the desks of ministers and say, look, if you do not fund this particular sector, then people will be coming to the public sector, people will be suffering, and you will end up picking up the bill anyway, and you will have destroyed an industry which was already delivering it. Okay, so in terms of mitigation, really from the state, it's been a pretty poor show, frankly, and let's hope that improves. And this is where we do need the umbrella organisations such as the COPCIOs, the NCVOs, to really be banging the drum. I think in terms of other areas, then St John has already spoken about efficiency and rationalisation as to what we can do going forward. People, of course, will want to be building their reserves. I'm chair of a military housing charity, and we're desperately looking to see how we can rebuild our reserves. But frankly, we're months, if not years away from getting beyond this current crisis to do that. So I'm afraid, in terms of what can be done, it's a pretty difficult position. And Deborah, then why don't you come in and pick up from there, please?
I completely support you, Ray. Without getting to the politics of it, the actual real truth about this is we cannot do this without your help. So those of us who work in infrastructure bodies or at the levels where we're engaging with government, we are doing our level best to put the case forward. But actually what we need is pressure from MPs of all political parties to the government to talk about this thing. And the thing is, nobody cares about charities. We don't even care about charities. What we care about are beneficiaries, the people that those charities are set up there to serve. And that's the point about the money. It's not about saving people's jobs in charities like it might be in the private sector or in other sectors. It's about saving services to beneficiaries. So it's a call to action to all of you, actually, is that there are campaigns out there. There's a website called www.mnm.org.uk, which we'll put in the QA and send out to you afterwards, which is the Never More Needed website, in which you can go and you can download templates of letters to write to your MPs and so forth. But we really need you to engage your charities, your beneficiaries, your trustees, your mates, anybody you know, to help us put the case forward. We can argue as much as we can, and we are. We can ask the public for more help, which we are, but we've got to bear in mind that we're working with a hugely generous, wonderful public who largely love armed forces charities, but who themselves are facing massive job losses and fear of financial future and all the rest of it. So, this isn't anything other than to say these are all difficult decisions for any government to make. I get that. The decisions at the moment are not going in favour of the charitable sector. I would argue that mostly it's because they don't understand. It's a raised point that actually the people we serve are going to end up being paid for out of the state anyway, and that they will have lost skills and expertise in that. But I would really, really encourage you, don't look just to us to do it. We will do what we can, but please, please, please engage yourselves.
Thanks for that, Deborah. The next question is on the topic of how we can better support small armed forces charities.
Sorry, could I just come in on that question of the question of how we're engaging with government, because we are doing something, I hope, that might produce results. I agree with completely that it was actually 9 million that we got in 2 tranches from the government, and compared to the requirements of the sector, that is inadequate. Indeed, the support for the whole charitable sector was inadequate. We then produced a survey, again, in harness with DSC and with FIMT, on our members, which demonstrated that they had 30% of them had 12 months reserves, and that 20% of them, just under 20%, thought they would have to merge or shut within 12 months. That's really difficult. What was even more difficult is that the funds that we were allocated had to be expended by the end of October. What the survey said was that actually the really difficult time, because reserves will cover them probably until the end of the year, will actually be in 2021 and perhaps even into 2022. And therefore further support is required. And when the Minister for Defence, People and Veterans, Johnny Mercer, came to the COBTO AGM, he did say that if there was evidence that there was a continuing requirement, he would be prepared to go back to the Treasury to ask for further support. Now, I think that's going to be really difficult to do as a subsector on our own, and therefore Deborah's point about a sector-wide initiative, including NBCO, is absolutely critical. But in order to make sure that we're properly have the proper ammunition in terms of evidence for that, we're going to be conducting another survey, again with the support of FIMT and DSC, in the autumn, to make sure that we can contribute the evidence required, we hope, to get government to produce further support. I do think it'll be an uphill battle, because as Deborah said, charities are not being well looked after by government at the moment, but we will have to do what we can with the evidence that we can gather. Thank you.
Thanks, Sir John. Our next question comes from Philida Parrott, who directs the question to Stuart, asking, just picking up on Stuart's point, which is how to keep the public donating when there aren't any high-profile armed forces anniversaries to encourage this, and the public will be struggling with a difficult economic environment. What ideas do we have that would help the public to keep donating and keep the armed forces charity sector afloat?
Great question. I suppose it comes to the point of who's, well, or rather, the public, as we know, as you said in your question, Philida, the public are facing a recession. The public have less disposable income, and there aren't those memory joggers of those emotive events like centenaries, etc., coming up. So it is a challenge, certainly. How do you get more charities to more individuals to support charities? Well, typically people tend to support causes which are in some way close to them, or in some way which they've supported for perhaps years. And it might be the case that that core group continue to support the charities. But as Ray and as Sir John said, the worry is if there isn't that public support, then who's responsible then? And that's where I would say the government has to step in, because there would be a significant poverty of skills and specialisms which would go. And once charities go, it's not okay. Well, we'll just go for a year and then come back. That's it. They're gone. And the specialists' knowledge and the collaborative working we've talked about, and all the gains made to make the sector as good as it is, starts to fall away. So, in terms of ideas for how to get the public donating, well, in many ways that might be down to individual charities, and the bigger national charities might be more equipped to do that because they have the infrastructure to exist online. But let's think of the smaller charities who perhaps don't have that, and they don't have that national representation. It might be local charities, it might be the smaller welfare charities or smaller association branches who really don't have the means to go online to generate income, and they are the ones who depend on fundraising events which just can't be held because of social distancing. So it is a problem which will be individual to a lot of charities, and the larger charities might be able to weather it better. I don't know. It depends on their circumstances. But I would say at this point, it's government which needs to step in to shoulder more of the responsibility.
Shannon, let me put forward a possibly slightly unpopular view. Because on this call and this project, this is all about armed forces charities, and generally, not exclusively, but people who use charities are people who have additional needs for whatever reason. And therefore, it's very easy on a subject like this to assume that our armed forces community is a very needy community. But the honest truth is that a huge proportion of the armed forces community are net contributors to society. And we have to be really careful. Now, we've got David Richmond, I see attending, who is the Director of the Office for Veterans Affairs, who I very much hope are going to be working with us on a piece of work to try and make sure that the public perceptions of the ex-service community is much more positive and that people are net contributors to society. So whilst it's important we do sustain our charity sector, we do keep in the public eye the need to donate, to support people in need, we mustn't allow it to overshadow the great contribution that people do make to society.
Thanks for that, Ray. So there's quite, again, a few questions that around the theme of COVID and charities' ability to fundraise in this new environment. Just to follow up on that theme, there's a further question from Matthew Lee, who asks, how would you characterise the capability of the sector to cope with further systemic shock? Stuart, could you offer any follow-ups on that one?
Yeah, this is probably a good one for Deborah actually. But what I would say is, in terms of more shock, well, this has been as great a shock to most charities as I imagine they've ever had, and the honest answer is I think there isn't so much leeway. This is, I think I said in the presentation that the time for saving may have gone. All those national events, which allowed charities to maybe build up a little bit of reserves, or allow charities to open new programs up. That may be maybe less coming in. So I would say charities do a lot with a little, and it might be the case that charities will have to withdraw certain programs of support. Now, tying back what Deborah says, that's all about the beneficiary. The beneficiaries are the ones who miss out when that happens. So really, there isn't much leeway. I'll hand over to Deborah because she might have a more insightful view on this, actually.
I'm just older and I've seen more things like this. I mean, this is completely unique. Let's be honest. Most of us know how to cope with a rainy day. This isn't a rainy day. This is a thunderstorm, a monsoon, a tsunami, an earthquake. It's like everything rolled into one. We're dealing with stuff we've literally never had to deal with before. And so I think we need to give ourselves an enormous amount of credit for the fact that actually we have been so resilient so far already, and that actually lots of actions are being taken. But I think for me, the most important thing to remember is that what is actually at the root of charitable endeavour, whether that's military charities or any other charities, it's about the real human drive to help each other. And that doesn't change. It doesn't change no matter how difficult, how broke, how worried we all are about the future. Human beings really want to help each other, and that doesn't go away. So if you look at, for example, the history of giving across charities, over time and over a very long time, it's incredibly stable. It bears very little relation. I mean, you get some shocks and economic hits, but largely speaking, it's relatively stable. It sort of does that. And what you find is that there's very often a bounce back, that when people themselves are in trouble, the psychological driver is for them to help other people in trouble. So over time, if you look back at the pattern of charitable giving around recessions and things like that, you very often find that there's I don't want to call it bounce back because I hate that phrase, and that's like funds and loans and things, isn't it? But there's kind of it touches people's hearts and they want to give more. The other thing to remember about the charitable sector is we've been around officially since 1604. I mean, around for a lot longer than that. We've weathered we weathered the Spanish Armada, for goodness sake, and world wars and all the rest of it. And the charitable sector, regardless of who's in power, what governments there are, what politics there are, what things there are, we still keep going. For me, the biggest problem is when trustees panic. is that when trustees become obsessed with the money and they think that that to shrink is failure. Whereas I think the charities that over time that I've seen, certainly over my 30 years in the sector, 30 plus years actually, in the sector, have been those charities that are prepared to say, okay, we were a £2 million charity and we're going to be a £500,000 charity for a bit, or else we recover. You know, there is no failure in shrinking. There is no failure in not having loads of money. There is no failure in losing funding bids, you know, when you're competing with other people around it. So I'm always, optimism is too small a word for it. I'm always really hopeful because my experience is that people tend to step up. That is not to diminish how difficult it is. That's not to diminish the fact that services are being cut left, right and centre. And that's not to diminish at all the horrible impact that this is going to have on the people that we serve in the shorter term. So it is a serious, serious problem. There's no question about that. But we will bounce back.
Thanks for that, Deborah. So discussion around small charities and particularly their voices being heard is also quite a prevalent theme in the topics of the questions being sent through. So our next question comes from Richard Cullen. And this is one perhaps best directed to Sir John, who asks, there is concern that the voice of small charities is not heard. The majority of charities in the sector have an income of less than 100,000, whereas there are only 44 major charities. However, the board of COBSU is dominated by these major charities. How can small charities be assured that their voices are heard?
Well, if I may say, it's a very good question and a very important question. I'd also make the observation that there is absolutely no atmosphere at the COBSU Executive Board that big is good and small is bad. In fact, I would say that very often our smaller charities are more efficient because they have very little in terms of overheads. They're more agile in adapting what they do. And also they're very local, and therefore they will adapt what they do to cater for what the requirements are on the ground at the time for the individual involved. And in the majority of cases, the support needed is actually local. It's not a national, it's a local requirement for an individual or a family. And therefore, it is absolutely right and proper that we should protect and promote the mixed economy, if you like, of the big and small charities in our sector. And I get very cross when I speak to people in government and in uniform, frankly, who should know better in what might be described as factory conversations, when they're telling me that we've got too many charities and that some of these smaller charities need to get out of the way to let the big boys get on. Absolutely not the case. The small charities, the niche charities, provide an absolutely essential component of our sector. So how do we make sure that their requirements are looked after? Well, first of all, on the COBSU board, we have six large charities as permanent members, and then we have Veterans Scotland as well, 7th with FIMPT, and then we have 9, 3 of whom are voted in every year. And we have recently taken steps to ensure that at any one time we absolutely do have a small charity on our board to speak up for small charities' needs. The other point is that we've also, as a consequence of questions raised at the AGM, are introducing, at the moment it's a discussion group, but it may well become a small charities cluster depending upon the subject matter and enthusiasm, because when we have a cluster, it's important. We have some that haven't gone well, mainly because there haven't been the appetite within the community to develop and drive the program. So at the moment it starts as a discussion group, but if there is enough enthusiasm within the small charity sector, and if somebody is prepared to lead it and drive it, then we will move it from a discussion group into a small charities cluster. So in those ways, I hope that we are promoting and protecting the interests of small charities, but we're very open to ideas of how we can do it better, and I'm sure that we can do it better. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Sir John. So another theme of our questions revolves around mental health, in particular concerns that some veterans may feel unseen or unheard when it comes to issues of mental health. I'm just looking at a few comments here, particularly one from Clive Spencer, and around the issue of veteran suicides, how charities could be better responding and sitting down with veterans to tackle that issue. Ray, could you share some insight on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd call it insight, Rhiannon, but there have been a lot of questions about various mental health issues. And I don't want people who've taken the time out to join us today to think that we're ignoring those. We're not. But it would be true to say that we are not really claiming here to be expert around the mental health area. Although having said that, of course, if you look at one of the reports that Directorate of Social Change did for us about a year ago, they did a sort of spotlight, a closer, in-depth look at mental health charities, and I would recommend that. And if I was smarter, I'd be able to wave a copy around at you now. I'm sure Stuart's got one tucked underneath his bookcase there. He says going for it, but I'm making light of it. It's not light at all. I mean, a couple of things I would observe is that when it comes to suicides, and that's cropped up a number of times in the Q&A box, that the MOD has funded a piece of research from Manchester to try and get to the bottom of what is actually going on. I think that's really important. So John has already mentioned Contact. This is a collaboration of not just charitable, but also public sector mental health providers to try and find better ways to deliver mental health. And then, of course, as a veteran, as a veteran's family, including myself, we are very much citizens of the state, and we expect our health needs to be delivered by the state. I would have to say that the NHSs in all 4 of the home nations have all upped their game considerably in the 8 years that Forces in Mind Trust has been around. It's by no means perfect, but if you look at things such as TILS and high intensity services, and apologies if those acronyms need nothing to you, but there has been a considerable amount of extra work being done by the NHS. Now, it's not perfect, I'm not claiming that, but I do think that the work of the charity sector, together with the public sector, I think in the area of mental health is where there have been improvements, but that is by no means to say it is perfect. What I'm not prepared to do, and I hope you'll appreciate my candor here, is I'm not prepared to single out individual charities from within our own sector and say they should be doing this. They all have boards of trustees. They set their strategies. Every one of us on this call has ultimately, the needs of the beneficiaries as our top and possibly only priority. So I don't think we should ignore that. And I don't think it's helpful, to engage in, individual criticisms when what we're trying to do here is to produce a real sort of pan-sector view, with the emphasis, as we said, on just improving things from what we already know. So thank you, Rhiannon. That's what I wanted to say.
Thanks for that, Ray. So we just have about 10 minutes or so left for a few final questions. So our next question comes from David Richmond. He asks, do we have any understanding of how much money the sector needs to deliver services and support to veterans? 1.1 billion annually is a huge amount already. Is it the case that the sector needs more money, or that it needs to use better the money it has and find ways of approaching it? Stuart, maybe if you could share some insight onto the sector's finances.
1.1 billion is the finding, and for the last few years it's been fairly stable at around the 1 billion mark. I think the question was along the lines, and correct me if I'm wrong, of should they be doing more with it, or looking for more, or I'd say
essentially the question was, is that enough? Is 1.1 billion in relative terms a large amount?
I see.
Is it well utilised?
Again, to go back to an answer I used before, it really depends on the individual charities. This isn't one pot of money which then all the charities get together and decide how they spend. This is generated by individual charities who have particular remits, who have make a particular ask, and as we've seen with some of the data, it's typically the welfare charities, and that's because they're the ones that ask the public for money. They're the ones which the public support and vote with their money to support. And they're the ones who will deliver that in a certain amount of programs. You could say, well, it'd be nice to have more, it'd be nice to do more, always. There's also a certain point at which a smaller charity may not seek to expand. It might be that what they do and the money, the income they get, does what they need to do. So it's very much a kind of horses for courses with different charities. I don't know if anyone else would like to jump in on this. By all means, but if not, I think that's my answer. Is it's individual charities, and they do what they can with that money. Some will want more, some will ask for more, some will do more with what they have. But that 1.1 billion is the collective amount of all charities of all types, from the £10,000 a year to the £5 million a year upwards.
I'll make an observation, if I may, and that is that I think that I'll be very surprised if that figure of around 1.1 billion, which you say has been static for the last few years as far as we can tell, I'll be very surprised if it remains static, given the headwinds that we're facing in terms of COVID, in terms of the profile of the armed forces community, in terms of austerity digging in, both in terms of government provision and in terms of the ability of the nation to contribute to charities. So I'd be very surprised if that figure did not go down. And what that means, as we've already alluded to, is there will be a requirement upon the sector, first of all, to prioritise the services that provide. And I know some large charities are staring down the barrel of some 30% loss of funding, and that's this year and next year, and that directly affects service provision. They will have to prioritise. And it also goes back to the question of how can we do things better in terms of making sure we get more to the people that we're actually trying to serve. And that involves efficiency and rationalisation. We've already covered how we can do that. So that's how I think the sector will move. And clearly in COBSIO, we will encourage you to do that. But I do think the report is a great baseline from which we can make the evidence-based decisions that we need to make in order to move forward. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Sir John. So we just have time for one final closing question. I'm aware that there's still quite a few questions open. You can get in touch with myself or Stuart. Our contact details are on the Armed Forces Charities website, www.armedforcescharities.org.uk. And thanks for everyone for taking the time to ask such interesting and insightful questions. So the final question I have for the panel is, which one key finding do you think is most important from the Sector Insight report? And I'll hand over to Ray to open up that.
Well, I would say, like all good research reports, this one concludes with a need for more research. But actually, I would fully support that. I mentioned, I think, in my intro that this previous pieces of work have been used to influence all sorts of policymakers to make better decisions for the benefit of the armed forces community. So, I mean, I'm a great believer that we need evidence to do that, but we also need foresight. And the Forces Mind Trust, for example, we're working with Future Agenda at the moment to deliver a piece of work looking at beyond 2031, imaginatively called Lifting Our Sights, which is a great play on words, but it's to try and get people actually looking beyond the current crisis, which is almost overwhelming all of my colleagues in COBSIO, overwhelming them in terms of the time they've got in the day to fix the problems that they're facing. So I think that we do need to carry on investing time and, yes, a bit of money in producing the evidence, even at this time when there are so many people who actually benefit from it being spent directly on them. And so things like evidence on the armed forces charity sector, things like lifting our sights are going to be really important. So for me, a Forces in Mind Trust, that would be my key takeaway.
Thanks for that, Ray. Deborah, did you want to share any insights?
Sure. The thing that particularly leaps out for me in the report is the issue around partnership and collaboration. I mean, you know, Sir John's absolutely right that it really is extremely high quality within the sector. And I think we need to hang on to that. Going into the really troubled times we've got ahead of us, it's going to be much harder to survive alone than it is to survive if we're working together in partnership. And I think particularly we've got to stop lobbing, missiles in each other's directions and bitching and moaning about other charities that appear to be doing things differently or better or whatever. That is not the way we're going to survive this. The way is going to be not just offering help to each other, but also being brave enough to ask for help as a smaller charity, to go to a larger charity if you need to and just say, can you help? Please, can we work together? I think that's the way we're going to get through this.
Thanks for that. Did anyone else on the panel have any final comments to add before I'll hand over to Ray to say the final word on the project and close today's session?
Not really. The ones mentioned were I think the most salient there. Rhiannon mentioned you can get in touch with us if there are any other questions. We'll try and pick out a few, maybe publish a few responses online. But from me and my team, really appreciate people attending.
Okay, thanks. Does anyone else on the panel want to make any closing remarks? Just wave at me if you do. If not, yes, John.
A final comment of May, and that is that if I was asked what's the key thing for me, it would have been that underlining the requirement to do things more efficiently in order to preserve the contribution to our beneficiaries. However, the additional thing I would say is that I think the report is immensely valuable because it really does underline what an extraordinary contribution to the quality of life of our armed forces community, the serving, the veterans and their families, that our sector makes. It is absolutely remarkable. And I was particularly taken by the comment that it's not an add-on, it's not a nice to have, it's actually essential to their quality of life. And if that's the case, then government should be doing everything it can if it really wants to make, to quote the government, the UK the best place in the world to be a veteran, and indeed a serving and families. If it really wants to do that, then it has got to get behind the sector. And so I think the report is immensely valuable in providing us the ammunition to go to government to make the case for what a wonderful contribution the sector makes. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sir John. Just before I make a couple of thank yous at the end, Stuart, could you just confirm whether the recording of this webinar is going to be made available to people who haven't been able to attend today?
It is. We're going to publish it on the DSC website. You'll be able to find it pretty easy on our site. I think it's, I don't have the URL off the top of my head, but you'll be able to find it if you just in our search engine on the DSC website. I think it's dsc.org.uk/sector insight. I'm pretty sure, but it will be apparent on our site. It'll also be on our project website, which is armedforcescharities.org.uk. So it will be there. It will be viewable, and you can watch it again.
Great, thanks, Stuart. So for those of you that want to get a copy of the report, you haven't done already, then armedforcescharities.org is where all this project stuff is held. Also, you can find any of this through either the DSC or indeed the Forces in Mind Trust websites. We'll have really good prominent links to all of that stuff. And then in terms of other resources, then we will keep those posted. And we will try and create an answer bank to some of the questions which we just haven't had time to answer directly. And some of them are quite individual and perhaps not we didn't want to use up the valuable time we had to answer them specifically, but we know we do have answers, and it would be a great pleasure to be able to hand those back to you. So finally then, I want to thank the Director of Social Change, in particular the team up in Liverpool who've delivered this project, continue to deliver so well and have reacted so swiftly and so expertly to the COBSIO needs in the times of COVID. Obviously, thank you to Deborah as Chief Exec as well, and for all your team. I know the board supports you very much. I would like particularly to thank Sir John McCall. Everyone else on this call, we're getting paid for being here. John isn't. John sat there giving up his free time and doing a fantastic job on behalf of the Confederation. So, Sir John, I personally thank you for that, and I'm sure on behalf of all the Armed Forces charities, not just the ones online here. But finally, I mean, we got up to nearly 200 participants. We're down to about 80, but thank you very much all of you who are on the call for attending today. I hope you found it interesting. If you have, then please do talk about it with your colleagues, with your friends, get the word out, and particularly share the resources which Stuart's spoken about. We'll be tweeting like mad about this. We'll be moving on to other projects as well. So lots more evidence to come. It's a really important subject. And on behalf of the Board of Forces in Mind Trust and all of us involved in this project, thank you once again for your time. And I hope you found this stimulating and interesting and helpful. Thank you.